Today we use rings to symbolize love and commitment, but why? Who invented this and for what reason? While its meaning has changed a lot over time, the tradition of wearing wedding rings is much older than you probably think. While today we accept that the wedding ring symbolizes love and commitment, that wasn't always the case. In fact, it didn't even start out that way. The origin of the wedding ring can be traced all the way back to ancient Egypt, at least 3,000 years ago, maybe more. That's kind of crazy. I don't know about you, but I thought that was like maybe a medieval thing at best. The circle, whose shape has no beginning and no end, symbolized eternity. This seems to be the first idea of what the ring symbolized. Notably, the circle also represented the sun and the moon, which were prominent symbols in Egyptian religion. And third, which I kind of think is the coolest, is the inside of the ring. The empty space represents a gate to the unknown, perhaps a portal to the afterlife. Later on in ancient Egyptian culture, the practice of wedding rings got pretty similar to what we do today already. Couples started exchanging rings, though rings made out of leather, hemp, and reeds, which were common materials that could be gathered along the Nile. This linked their symbol of eternity to each other. I think the most interesting thing about all of this is that ancient Egyptians didn't just invent the wedding ring, but specifically wearing it on the ring finger. If anyone's seen my last videos, already accidentally flipped my viewers off twice so far. It's not happening a third time. It probably is, but not this time. See? But yeah, that's crazy. Thousands of years ago, they already invented the tradition of basically what we do today, exchanging rings and putting them specifically on the ring finger. God, it makes me nervous. They believed in the vena amoris. I wasn't looking down here hallucinating. The vena amoris that ran from the ring finger directly to the heart. We've discovered that this idea isn't actually anatomically correct, but it's just too late to change it, just like my email address from middle school. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, the Greeks embraced the tradition. They were the first culture to wholly associate the ring with love. Some of these rings actually featured depictions of the god of love, Cupid, and the Greeks kept the tradition of wearing it on the middle finger. Ring finger. And the Greeks kept the tradition of wearing it on the ring finger. Then when the Romans later conquered Greece, they too adopted the custom, and they started to commonly use iron and copper rings. In Rome, wedding rings weren't just romantic symbols, they also signified legal ownership. Some rings even had inscriptions declaring a woman's status in the household. Finally, by the 2nd century, gold rings had sort of become the norm, like they are today. Of course, this did exclude people that couldn't afford it, but they were much more common than they once were. I imagine it was something similar to today, actually, where even people in lower classes with less money will go out of their way to buy a solid gold ring just because it's the tradition. As metallurgy advanced and the craftsmen who worked with metal got better and better, artisans were able to craft much more intricate rings. This was especially prevalent in signet rings within this time, and I made a whole video on that, which explores the entire history of just the signet ring. There's such an extensive history about it. If you like rings and the history of them, check that out. So while Greek and Roman influence made rings a lot more intricate and they started becoming more commonly made in gold now, they still weren't quite exactly like how we picture a wedding ring today. But finally, in the medieval period, which is so much later than the invention of the ring, I mean, by now it's already probably 1,000, 2,000 years old at least. In the medieval period, wedding rings actually began to be set with precious gemstones, like the typical woman's wedding ring is today. Certain stones symbolize different things. Medieval people were much more open to using a variety of gemstones, which is a big opinion that I hold today, and I hope that we can get back to what we were doing 500 years ago. For example, medieval people believed that rubies symbolized passion and diamonds symbolized strength. And interestingly, diamonds weren't faceted in the medieval period because they're so hard and tough to carve, so they were actually usually set just as raw stones. And instead of being valued for their brilliance, they were actually valued for their toughness. So usually you'd have a pretty unclear diamond, but that's actually back then what made them desirable. Kind of ironic by today's standards. The first documented diamond wedding ring was given to Mary of Burgundy in 1477. After about 1,500 to 2,000 years at least, the wedding ring has finally began to resemble pretty much what it is today. So up until now, within medieval Europe, wedding ceremonies were pretty unofficial. They were informal agreements, so a couple could literally just deny it ever happened. So over time, the church got more involved in regulating marriages, requiring official ceremonies and witnesses. It's possible that this is actually where the process of two rings began, the engagement ring and the wedding ring, the first possibly being a ring that was more private and sentimental between the couple, and the latter being an official ring that was sanctioned by the church. So by the end of the medieval period, the whole practice of wedding rings and the wedding ring itself is pretty damn similar to what it is today. Wedding rings became super ornate by the time the Victorian period rolled around, and this is also when diamond wedding rings began to really surge in popularity. This was actually due to Queen Victoria's famed love for diamond jewelry. But even though diamonds were becoming popular, they were still one of numerous gemstones that were set into wedding rings. But by the 50s and 60s, like you probably see today, diamonds were in full swing. I mean, pretty much the only option. Putting a diamond in a ring was becoming a man's way to show that his woman was worth it. And of course, also his way of demonstrating his earning power. In 1939, only about 10% of wedding rings were set with a diamond. By 1990, thanks to the De Beers Company's wildly successful marketing, that number skyrocketed to 80%. Insane. I mean, that's pretty much every ring. Perhaps most interesting of all, at least in my perspective, is that throughout the wedding ring's entire history, it was only worn by women. The concept of a men's wedding ring really only became a thing in like the past 100 years. This was due in part to soldiers during World War I and II to honor and remember their loved ones when they were deployed. And eventually, clearly, this caught on with civilians. Today, thankfully, diamond wedding rings are starting to decline in popularity. And I have nothing against diamonds. It's my birthstone, so I'm very biased towards diamonds actually. But I think it's just kind of lame that they've taken the whole industry by a chokehold and people assume it's their only option when there's so many different options you really have. Whole video discussing why another stone is by far the best stone in my opinion to put in a wedding ring. I personally love the idea of a wedding ring because we're continuing a tradition that our ancestors have been doing for thousands of years by now. The meaning behind the wedding ring has changed over such a long period of time. So maybe the question isn't how much you should spend on a ring, but what you want it to symbolize. So, I hope you learned something. This was fun to make. I think knowing the history about everyday objects makes them way more special and just frankly more exciting to wear and be around. So, thanks for watching.